Welcome back. Today we're going to go into the smallest unit of life, the cell. And the reason that we want to do that is because if you start to understand the cell, everything else in physiology makes sense. Today we're going to cover what makes things alive and talk about how the cell membrane controls what comes in and what goes out. We're also going to talk about the organelles and what cells produce energy and how it uses it. And finally, we're going to talk about how cell failure turns into a full organ failure. If you want to follow along, you can always get the digital workbook, which is available in the description below. Let's get into it. The cell, life at the microscopic level. What makes something alive? When we talk about cells, it helps to start with a simple question. What actually makes something alive? A rock isn't alive, a chair isn't alive, but a human body is. The difference isn't size or shape. The difference is that living things can take in energy, use it, respond to their environment, and maintain balance. Life requires constant work. Cells have to move substances in and out. They have to repair damage. They have to respond to stress. None of that happens automatically. It requires energy and organization. A cell isn't just a tiny building block. It's an active system that is constantly adapting to stay alive. One of the defining features of life is the ability to maintain an internal environment that's different from the outside world. Cells carefully control what enters and what leaves. They regulate water, electrolytes, oxygen, and waste. When that control is lost, the cell can't survive for long. Another key feature of life is the ability to respond to change. When oxygen levels drop, cells adjust how they make energy. When nutrients are scarce, they slow down non-essential processes. When damage occurs, they attempt repair. These responses are what allow tissues and organs to survive stress, at least for a while. From an EMS perspective, this matters because patients don't deteriorate at the organ level first. They deteriorate at the cellular level. Long before an organ fails, its cells are already struggling to keep up with energy demands and maintain balance. What you see on the outside is the result of millions of tiny systems starting to fall behind. As we move through this chapter, keep one idea in mind. The cell is the smallest unit of life, but it's also the most important one. Every symptom you see, every vital sign you measure, and every form of organ failure you treat can be traced back to what's happening inside these microscopic systems. Understanding cells isn't about memorizing parts under a microscope. It's about understanding how life works and what happens when it starts to break down. The cell membrane and permeability. Every cell is surrounded by a thin barrier called the cell membrane. This membrane is what separates the inside of the cell from the outside world. Without it, the cell couldn't survive. The membrane isn't just a wall. It's an active gatekeeper that decides what is allowed in and what is kept out. The cell membrane is made mostly of fat molecules arranged in a double layer. This structure allows the membrane to be flexible while still holding its shape. Embedded within that layer are proteins that act like doors, channels, and pumps. Together, these parts control movement across the membrane. Some substances move easily across the membrane. Oxygen and carbon dioxide pass through without much resistance. Water can also move across, but it follows rules based on concentration. Other substances, like sodium, potassium, and calcium, are tightly controlled. They require specific channels or energy-driven pumps to cross the membrane. This selective movement is called permeability. Permeability describes how easily a substance can pass through the cell membrane. A healthy cell carefully maintains permeability to keep the right balance of fluids and electrolytes inside. When that balance is disturbed, the cell begins to struggle. From an EMS perspective, this matters because many critical conditions disrupt membrane control. Hypoxia reduces the cell's ability to power its pumps. Electrolyte imbalances change how ions move. Toxins and medications can alter membrane function. When permeability is lost, water rushes in, the cell swells, and normal function breaks down. The cell membrane also plays a key role in communication. Receptors on the membrane allow cells to respond to hormones, neurotransmitters, and medications. When a drug works, it's often because it interacts with something on the cell membrane. When it doesn't work, it's often because the membrane or its receptors are impaired. When the cell membrane fails, the cell loses control. It can no longer regulate its internal environment. This is often the first step towards cell injury and death. Long before an organ fails, its cells are already losing their ability to protect themselves. As we continue, keep this idea in mind. Many EMS problems aren't about organs suddenly stopping. They're about cells slowly losing control over what comes in and what goes out. The membrane is where that loss of control begins. Organelles and their jobs. Inside every cell are specialized structures called organelles. Each organelle has a specific job, and together they keep the cell alive and functioning. Instead of thinking of a cell as an empty space, it helps to picture it as a busy workplace where different departments handle different tasks. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. It holds the genetic instructions that tell the cell how to function and when to repair itself. The nucleus doesn't run day-to-day operations, but it provides the blueprint that everything else depends on. If the nucleus is damaged, the cell loses its ability to maintain long-term function. Mitochondria are the power plants of the cell. Their job is to produce energy in the form of ATP. Cells with high energy demand, like muscle cells and nerve cells, have large numbers of mitochondria. When mitochondria fail, energy production drops, and the cell can no longer keep up with its workload. The endoplasmic reticulum acts like an assembly line. It helps build proteins and lipids that the cell needs to function. Some of these proteins stay inside the cell, while others are sent elsewhere. When this system is disrupted, the cell struggles to maintain its structure and communicate properly. The Golgi apparatus is the packaging and shipping department. It modifies proteins, sorts them, and sends them to their proper destinations. Without this step, even properly built proteins can't reach where they're needed. Lysosomes act as the cleanup crew. They break down waste, damaged components, and foreign material. This recycling process is essential for cell health. When lysosomes fail, waste builds up and begins to interfere with normal function. All of these organelles work together. If one system starts to fail, others quickly feel the strain. Energy production affects membrane pumps. Waste buildup affects chemical balance. Communication slows. What starts as a small internal problem can quickly spread through the entire cell. For EMS providers, the key takeaway isn't memorizing organelle names. It's understanding that cells depend on internal systems just like the body does. When stress, hypoxia, or toxins disrupt those systems, cells lose the ability to function long before organs visibly fail. As we move forward, you'll see these organelles come up again and again, especially when we talk about energy, hypoxia, and shock. The details matter less than the idea that cells are active systems, not static structures. Energy production and ATP. Everything a cell does requires energy. Moving substances across the membrane, repairing damage, sending signals, and maintaining balance all depend on a steady supply of energy. That energy comes in the form of a molecule called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the cell's usable fuel. ATP is produced mainly inside the mitochondria. To make ATP efficiently, cells need oxygen. Oxygen allows mitochondria to extract large amounts of energy from nutrients like glucose. When oxygen is available, cells can meet their energy needs with relatively little effort. When oxygen delivery drops, ATP production drops with it. Cells don't stop working immediately. Instead, they switch to backup methods that produce much less energy. These emergency pathways can keep a cell alive for a short time, but they come with consequences. they produce less ATP and create acidic byproducts that interfere with normal function. As ATP levels fall, the cell has to make choices. Non-essential processes shut down first. Repair slows. Communication becomes less precise. Eventually, even basic survival functions begin to fail. Membrane pumps stop working effectively. Electrolytes shift. Water moves into the cell. Swelling begins. From an EMS perspective, this is why oxygen delivery matters so much. It's not just about oxygen saturation or airway numbers. It's about whether cells can make enough ATP to stay alive. A patient can look stable while their cells are already running on emergency power. This is also why restoring oxygen late doesn't always fix the problem. If cells have been without adequate ATP for too long, damage may already be done. The system may not recover fully, even when oxygen is reintroduced. When you hear terms like hypoxia, ischemia, or shock, they all connect back to this idea. They describe different ways cells are being deprived of the energy they need to function. A TP is the common thread that ties these conditions together. As we move into the final point of this chapter, keep this idea in mind. Organ failure doesn't start at the organ level. It starts when cells can no longer make enough energy to keep themselves alive. Why cell failure equals organ failure. Organs don't fail on their own. They fail because the cells that make them up can no longer do their jobs. Every organ in the body is built from millions of cells working together toward the same goal. When enough of those cells begin to fail, the organ follows. Cell failure usually starts quietly. Energy production drops. Membrane control weakens. Waste builds up. Communication between cells becomes less precise. At first, the body compensates. Other cells work harder. Blood flow is redirected. Function is preserved, at least on the surface. As stress continues, more cells begin to fall behind. The organ loses efficiency. It may still be working, but not well. This is when patients often look off without clear signs of collapse. The problem exists, but it hasn't declared itself yet. When cell failure reaches a tipping point, organ failure becomes visible. The lungs can no longer exchange gas effectively. The heart can no longer maintain output. The kidneys can no longer regulate fluid and electrolytes. What looks like sudden organ failure is actually the final stage of a process that started at the cellular level. This is why EMS providers sometimes feel like a patient crashed out of nowhere. In reality, the cells had been struggling long before the vital signs changed. The body ran out of reserve. Understanding this changes how you assess patients. It teaches you to look for early signs of cellular stress instead of waiting for obvious organ failure. Subtle changes in mental status, skin signs, work of breathing, and energy level matter because they reflect what's happening at the cellular level. This concept also explains why early intervention is so powerful. Supporting oxygen delivery, perfusion, and energy production early helps cells survive. Once widespread cell failure sets in, even aggressive treatment may not be enough to reverse the damage. The big takeaway from this chapter is simple. Cells are where life happens. When cells fail, organs fail. When organs fail, patients deteriorate. If you can think at the cellular level, you can understand the patient in front of you long before the collapse occurs. Well, that wraps up this lesson. If you're working through the course, you can click the top tile to go to the next chapter. And don't forget to get the digital workbook that goes through every one of these chapters so you can actively learn them. The link is in the description down below. We'll see you in the next class.